Hello and welcome to today's main event, presenting the 2023 Nimdzi Interpreting Index. My name is Tucker Johnson, and I will be hosting the event today. For those of you that are new to Nimdzi events, then I'll just give you some quick introductions here. And that introduction is that we are hosting this event live on LinkedIn. And so for those of you that are joining us on LinkedIn, you can join in the comments section, and we will be able to bring your comments up on screen and take part in the conversation. This is a live event, so treat it like a real event. A network in the comments section, reach out, meet people, talk to us, ask questions, all of that good stuff. Today's event is discussing the 2023 Interpreting Index. This is a biannual report published by Nimdzi Insights analyzing the interpreting market. It is available now for viewing, and you can also download the beautiful PDF version from nimdzi.com. I'm going to go ahead and drop a link into the chat as soon as I go off the screen here so that you guys can have a direct link to that. Also, if you are a multilingual magazine subscriber, check your mailbox and you will be treated to a hard copy of the report. Beautiful copy. I got to see a few versions myself when I was over in Sandpoint. You'll be treated to that directly in your mailbox, so keep an eye open for that. Quick introduction to today's guests. First, we have Rosemary Hynes, who began her journey with a Bachelor of Arts in Applied Languages and continued with the postgraduate degree diploma in translation and interpreting. It was during this time that she found her true calling in conference interpreting, leading her to complete an MA in conference interpreting in her native Ireland. Some might say that the Irish gift of gab influenced her, but her love of languages and passion for bridging language barriers are likely the driving forces. Now a freelance conference interpreter, she brings her insider knowledge to the market and to Nimdzi in her role as interpreting researcher. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first guest today, Rosemary, and I will also introduce my colleague Renato, who probably doesn't need a lot of introduction. Renato Beninatto and I founded Nimdzi Insights about 5 or 6, 7 years ago, lost track. He's the CEO and co-founder of Nimdzi. He's also a powerhouse in the field of international business, bringing decades of experience with him wherever he goes. His extensive background in international consulting, market research, sales, and marketing is truly remarkable. Guided by his expertise, Renato provides the strategic direction that enables Nimdzi to serve clients all around the world more effectively. His insights have shaped the way that the industry operates, and his leadership continues to drive innovation and success. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming in the chat Renato and Rosie. Rosie, I'm going to turn it over to you first because I know Renato has a tendency of talking too much, so take it away, Rosie.
Thank you, Tucker. Thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. And I don't want to steal Sarah Hickey's thunder because this is mainly her baby, this project, and she cannot be with us today because she is on maternity leave. So big shout out to her and her beautiful family and newborn baby.
Yes.
So
Congratulations, Sarah. I hope you're watching us.
I hope so too. So if we get cracking, the Nimdzi Interpreting Index, which is a bit like its predecessor for the whole language services industry, the Nimdzi 100, actually ranks the biggest interpreting language service providers or LSPs in the industry. And it's done biennially, so every 2 years. And it looks at the fiscal revenues of companies from the previous fiscal year. So this year's Interpreting Index is based on the fiscal revenues from 2022. And in this year's ranking, we had 34 companies, and we focused on identifying interpreting LSPs with a revenue of more than $4 million. So without further ado, let's take a look at the next couple of slides, which show the top 20 interpreting LSPs. So for the third time in a row, Language Line Solutions takes the lead. And what a lead it is, as you can see here. It is also close. It is close. Well, it's not closely followed. It's followed in second and third position by Sorensen Communications and AMN Language Services. And the two front runners, so Language Line and Sorensen, have a roughly $200 million lead on the next biggest interpreting LSP. And if you have been keeping track of the Nimdzi Interpreting Indexes over the years, you'll see that for 2022, Cyracom International actually dropped from the second place that it held in 2019 and 2021 to fourth place. So it dropped from second to fourth. And I'd like to highlight here that Sorensen Communications is the largest provider of American Sign Language interpreting services in the whole world. And it's the market share leader for video relay services, which is a special publicly funded video phone service for deaf people in the United States. And now Nimdzi has known for a long time that Sorensen is among the largest LSPs in the world, but so far we only had them on our watch list because they didn't disclose their revenue. However, public records now show that Sorensen reached a stunning $891 million in 2020, 837 million in 2021, and for 2022, we estimated a total revenue of $825 in the Nimdzi 100 ranking, so the sister ranking on all of the language services. So we estimated for this index, the interpreting index, that roughly 55% of Sorensen's overall revenue is made up of interpreting, so bringing it to a total of 453.8 million. It's worth noting as well that 9 out of the 10 companies in the top 20, 9 of the top 10, are headquartered in English-speaking countries. So there's only one global talk which is headquartered in the Netherlands. And if you look at the data from this year's figures, the results are overwhelmingly positive. So 25 out of the 34 LSPs on the ranking reported positive growth. And out of these, would you believe, 15 had double-digit growth and 5 even reported triple-digit growth. It's also worth taking a brief look at position 14 and position 20, so Digital Talk and Interprify. These are both tech companies, or at least they call themselves tech companies, but are increasingly branching into services, and it's becoming impossible to even distinguish interpreting tech from interpreting services. So what we are now fully including interpreting tech under the umbrella term of interpreting services, and now they have been included on the ranking for the very first time with 100% of their revenue, as you can see here. So if we look at the growth by ranking segment now, and if we look at the top 34 and how much their combined revenues grew compared to the combined revenues of the top providers from the previous 2 periods that we looked at. And now I find this graph slightly confusing because I believe it should be the opposite, 2018, 2020 on the left and 2020, 2022 on the right.
Very good point.
That's how I view the world. I'm sure you guys out there understand that. So between 2020 and 2022, the combined revenues of the top interpreting service providers grew by 52.6%, compared to the previous period where they only grew by 17.8%. So that's a huge difference of 34.8 percentage points. And the ranking segment with the strongest growth are the companies in the top 10 positions. As you can see there in the second set of columns, whose combined revenues increased by 62.5% over the last 2 fiscal years, compared to 20.7% for the previous 2 years. So quite stunning figures. If we look at the revenues of the top LSPs in our biennial rankings, and if we dig down into the individual companies and look at the actual US dollars that they have amounted to, we'll see that the average growth rate for the financial period between 2020 and 2022 comes out at 61.8%. So I'm not sure which one you have there, Tucker.
I may have copied the wrong number.
Never mind.
Pretend that's 61%.
It actually turns out that it's a 61.8% growth rate. Maybe that was the previous year. So all these figures are quite impressive, but we must stress that they represent growth over 2 financial years, because our report comes out every 2 years. Now, while you might be wondering where this all comes from, this growth, and while a significant portion can be attributed to M&A in the interpreting market, not all of this growth comes from that. A number of companies also reported growth due to an increased demand, and this is particularly thanks to a spike in remote interpreting since the COVID-19 pandemic. And another contributing factor were also large government contracts. So over to you, Renato, to briefly discuss this market sizing.
Well, let's talk. This market sizing is part of the exercise that we do here, and the Interpreting Index has allowed us to take a snapshot of this growing part of the industry. So our estimate is this represents about $10 billion in 2022. And we estimate that in 2023, that number will expand to $10.7 billion. So in 2021, our estimate was that the market would reach $9.3 billion in 2022. But if you consider the high growth figures of the 34 positions between 2020 and 2022, which Rosie just showed, we are revising this estimate to reflect a one-off increase of 10%. In this period of 2020 to 2022, there was an unusual spike in growth. So going forward, we can expect that growth is going to slow down compared to the last 2 years, but it will still be stronger than the pre-pandemic times, thanks to the higher adoption and the increased awareness of virtual interpretation. So from 2023 onward, we expect that the market will grow at a CAGR, which is this compound annual growth rate of 6.2%. And this will take us to about $13.6 billion in 2027. So this is a very, very strong and resilient market when it comes to growth. Let's talk a little bit about the consolidation in our industry. Although it continues, the interpreting market is still predominantly made up of many small companies and one-person operations. The companies in our ranking account for just under 24% of the overall interpreting industry in 2022. So, this represents an increase of 5% if we compare to 2020. In absolute figures, the 72 companies that we track, which include those on the watch list, the ones that we don't have official revenues for, they earned about $3.8 billion in the last fiscal year. Taking into account the top 10 companies that earned $1.97 billion, this means that they were responsible for about 51.7%, or just over half of the total market. For a few years now, M&A activity and investment in the language services industry has been on the rise. We read almost every day that another company has been acquired. In the interpreting sector, it doesn't really come as a surprise that with the explosion of virtual interpreting technologies and innovation, investors are very, very interested and their heads are turning. Buslingo, for example, it's an interpreting, delivery, and management platform, received $3.4 million in Series A funding in 2018, and then another in August 2021. And in March 2022, they acquired VoiceBoxer, which is an RSI platform, and Interpreter Intelligence, which is an interpreting management system, or IMS. This helped consolidate them in a position as the market leader in this space. Then you have Cloudbreak Marty, which is now part of UpHealth. They received $10 million investment in 2020, and before that, they had received $25 million in investments. Genie, a company that also specializes in healthcare interpreting, raised $9.3 million in Series A funding in 2022. The RSI platforms like Interprify, Kudo, and Interactio have received investment over the past few years. But it's interesting to notice that the investment is paying off better in the OPI, or over-the-phone interpretation, and video remote interpreting sectors than the RSI, or the remote simultaneous interpreting field. Kudo and Interaxio were companies that raised significant funds, but both of them had layoffs in the following 2 years. And this is possibly related to the fact that the pandemic generated this massive remote interpreting boom, and it has not been sustainable in this post-pandemic period. So on the other side, the VIT providers, and this is a soup of acronyms, the virtual interpreting technology providers in the OPI and VRI space, are still talking about hyper growth spurts in 2023. So while and we're going to see later in another slide, you can see that there is a shift in the modes of delivering interpretation, but not in the quantity is growing at the same time. But if we look at the portfolio of OPI and VRI companies who received funding, all of them get a great part of their business from the healthcare sector. And this is a field that is less prone to high fluctuations in demand. It's interesting times ahead of us. So another point to consider is the margins of the companies. Nimdzi has been tracking the evolution of gross margins tied to both interpreting and translation services for a number of years, and this seems to be, for obvious reasons, a very interesting data point for investors and decision makers. And but margins have been very stable over the time that we've been following this space. The average gross margins for translation are in the 40 to 50% range, while in the interpreting it has historically been between 30 and 40%. But data from the surveys that we conduct to build our Nimdzi 100 show that this is maintained at the same level, so it still holds true. In the 2021 edition of the Nimdzi Interpreting Index, the previous one, we reported that for interpreting services, the gross margin range started widening to 30 to 50%, which we linked at that time to the boom in remote interpreting that typically enjoys higher profit margins. There are less of the time incentives and there are no travel costs. This year, however, significantly fewer LSPs have told us that their margins were in this 41 to 50% bracket for interpreting. So only 14.3%, which is the same amount as those who said that the gross margins were in the 11 to 20% range. So we see that there is a more normal distribution to the margins in our space. But something that is really exciting after this soup of numbers, and for our audience, I'm sure Rosie is now going to tell us what is going on in the market and what are the key trends moving forward.
Yes,
back to you, Rosie.
Thank you, Renato. Let's look at a few key trends that we've seen that have kept coming up time and time again in our data. So the first thing that I'd like to bring to your mind, and perhaps you've heard of it from the Nimdzi 100 as well, is what we've dubbed the new LSP. And it might not necessarily be a new trend, but it's one that just keeps coming back time and again. And at the core of this trend is the desire from LSPs to not just be external vendors, but rather an extension of the client's operations. So they do this by becoming hyper customer centric, adding new services, adjacent services, and embedding themselves so deeply into the client's internal structure that it means that they are almost impossible to cut ties with. And how do they go about doing this? Well, in the area of meetings and events, as well as corporate communication, interpreter service providers have expressed that they want their clients to turn to them whenever they have any need to improve communication, so any spoken communication. So they become a type of communications consultant. The second point is about this in-housing, and I'll try and explain this to make it clear. But some LSPs are hiring back former in-house staff of, let's say, hospitals. It tends to be more frequent in hospitals. So staff that used to be in-house in hospitals are leaving those hospitals, or the hospitals are letting them go. But then they're being rehired by the LSPs that work with those hospitals as in-house staff at the LSP. And in this way, the LSP becomes the extension of the hospital staff, but the hospital, so the LSP's client, doesn't actually have to bear any of the costs of having in-house staff. That's the LSP who does that. And in addition to providing language services, interpreting service providers are increasingly helping to solve all types of client issues. For example, integrating a telehealth system with an interpreting system. So they're going beyond just simply providing basic interpreting services. And this can also be seen in increasing event management as well. And as LSPs are diversifying their service offering, like I mentioned above, many are trying to come up with a new name, a new brand that better reflects this brand new reality, and ultimately generates better leads and better reflects what they're doing. So RSI providers, so remote simultaneous interpreting providers, are increasingly describing themselves as online event platforms, and interpreting service providers, as I mentioned earlier, as communications consultants. Another trend is the talent shortage, which we already saw coming up in the Nimdzi 100 as well. And it is increasing. It is a serious problem for the interpreting industry. All interpreting companies, regardless of size, listed a shortage of interpreters as one of their key business challenges in 2023. So LSPs of all sizes reported that ever since the pandemic and the increasing shift to remote interpreting, it's becoming harder to find interpreters to fill on-site assignments. Now, at Nimdzi, we have several hypotheses for these, and I'm going to list a few now. So when the pandemic hit, perhaps some interpreters left the profession and simply never came back. They found more secure professions where they were no longer freelancers or for other reasons. The industry basically shut down overnight, perhaps pushing some of them out of work. Perhaps another hypothesis is that interpreter graduates or newly trained interpreters never really got a foothold in the market, in this market that simply vanished overnight. Then another hypothesis is that maybe poor rates and poor conditions pushed interpreters out of the market, and all of this was worsened by the pandemic, and they never came back into the profession. Or, quite simply, perhaps interpreters now prefer remote work and the flexibilities that offers, and didn't want to have to travel long distances to complete on-site assignments. In any case, one side effect of this talent shortage is that interpreter education is increasingly falling onto LSPs, which is time-consuming for them and costly. One example is that an LSP told us that with the refugee crisis caused by the Ukraine war, there were only 4 or 5 Ukrainian interpreters in the country in which they work, and they had to train a whole load of interpreters in order to fill that huge demand. We can skip that. So remote versus on-site interpreting. So just to discuss about this post-pandemic equilibrium, and this is what Renato mentioned earlier about the split between the different types of interpreting. So in the 2021 edition of the Interpreting Index, we already predicted that remote interpreting is here to stay, and that even after the pandemic, the split between on-site and remote interpreting would never go back to the way it was before May 2020. So it seems that this is panning out. I think everyone can see this. And the results now show that according to our latest research, it's all holding up with only a few minor variations. So if we take a closer look, you'll see here that, and I don't know if you probably don't have the Nimdzi 2021 Interpreting Index in your mind, unless you're a massive Nimdzi fan, but you'll see that there is an additional hybrid box here, which overlaps between on-site and RSI, because it occurs both on an RSI platform and with people attending a meeting on-site. So we've added this here to represent the increase in hybrid meetings.
So I think, Rosie, that this graph is one of the most exciting outcomes of this report, because it's a very graphical image of how this segment of the language industry has transformed during the pandemic, and it explains all this data that we have been sharing of trends and what is happening with different companies and different modes of delivering interpretation. So interpretation, at the end of the day, is somebody delivering communication, oral communication in a different language. But what this shows is how it is delivered today, right? So it's fascinating that pre-pandemic, there was this preponderance of on-site interpreting, the image of the interpreter as a jet setter, the conference interpreter going to different countries and conferences and headsets and so on. And the pandemic forced, we said in previous versions of our interpreting index that remote interpreting was a solution in search of a problem, that remote interpreting was a technology that was available. It has been available for years, but people, and when I say people, I mean interpreters and LSPs and the translation companies preferred the usual way of dealing with a daily rate, with some security in the work. And the pandemic comes, and it was fascinating how people moved to remote interpreting almost seamlessly, almost immediately. It's like that technology was there, ready to replace the way that we were doing business before. And you have this spike, almost half of the market went to RSI, and that 80% that was on site goes basically to remote, and OPI takes also a big jump. And now we're going to a new reality. Now we have choice, let's put it this way, on both sides of the picture. You have the choice for the client that has immediacy, has choice, has the ability to have an interpreter on the spot, just like on OPI, in a matter of seconds or minutes. And on the other side, you have the choice also from the interpreter. You indicated in the previous slide, we were talking about how interpreters now prefer to work from home. Instead of having one assignment per day, they might be able to have 2 or 3 or 4 shorter assignments. And it also affected the way pricing is determined for some of these engagements. So I think that this is probably the most relevant graph in this whole presentation, in the sense that it shows in a very visual way this transition, this change that drove all this M&A, margin changes, growth in revenue. This is the picture. I would say if I had one takeaway from this, is this great image. And the hybrid situation is amazing, because it allows, now it's more normal for you to have a choice between being present and remote, because both solutions can be delivered at the same time.
Yeah, I completely agree, Renato. Now, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a proponent of interpreters doing 2, 3, 4 assignments in a day. It's flexible work has opened up a number of different opportunities. Absolutely. And I also think it's important to raise something that one of the LSPs that we interviewed for this index actually told us, which goes back to something that Sarah and I were discussing and looking into as we were doing this sizing and this split, which was initially, as we were researching it, we thought that we would have to massively decrease the percentage of over the phone interpreting and increase the percentage of video remote interpreting. And as one one LSP also told us, they thought the same thing when they installed video remote interpreting screens in hospitals. They thought they would see a massive decrease in OPI. But it actually turns out that wasn't the case, that because more people were aware of VRI, because they saw these visible screens, they actually also used OPI, and the share of OPI also shot up. And especially because in hospitals, some people don't necessarily want to have their faces visible for whatever reason, or else bandwidth is a bit unstable in hospitals. So we actually had to maintain a relatively solid percentage for OPI, as opposed to what we thought maybe that video remote interpreting would completely take over.
And you also have other segments for OPI that are not in the healthcare space that still drive a lot of demand. You have the case with emergency services, you have financial services. I mean, who cares? If you're complaining about your bank balance or your insurance, if you can see the customer representative's face, it's just a very voice-driven interaction, right? So there is that area where video remote interpreting is not an added value, let's put it this way, or overrated.
And may I also add that this graph, this diagram doesn't show machine interpreting, which, as it gains a share in the market, it will probably have to be represented here as well in future market estimations, because at the moment it's perhaps a negligible percentage, but as we will have to take this into account as well for these market estimations. And it will be interesting to see what type of percentage machine interpreting laps up over the coming years.
This is going to be an interesting discussion. I think that it's a space to watch. I have a bad feeling that machine interpretation will be like Google translation, is like the kind of stuff that people take for granted and expect it to be free. So we need to look at the market forces, how this is going to be deployed, why is it going to be deployed, and if it was going to be deployed.
We do indeed, and it requires its whole own Nimdzi Live in and of itself.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So moving on from that very interesting graph there, so I'd like to raise the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, which I'm sure you've heard of. And one extremely well-known area that is linked to interpreting is, of course, sign language interpreting. And although it's a very well-established service, there are still many misconceptions about sign language interpreting, such as that captions are just as good, which is based on this mistaken belief that signed languages are based on spoken languages. So this brings us to a more broader point about DEI, which is that it can just increase opportunities for everyone, be they with disabilities or without, because not everyone necessarily speaks one single language in a given country or region. So it just will enable more people to have access to more services, whereas in official settings, it's quite easy to have access, or relatively easy to have access to interpreters. There are limited access to interpreters in all walks and areas of life. So interviews with LSPs from all areas of the market have actually proven that requests for proposals, particularly from governments, but from private clients as well, are actually increasingly including DEI clauses, which is a step in the right direction. I think you'd all agree. And now let's move on to another technological question. So this is artificial intelligence for the interpreting sector. Now, I'm not going to go into ChatGPT unless you really want me to, But if we just focus on what's really up my street, we can talk about machine interpreting and Kai tools. So you perhaps know what machine interpreting is, but if not, it's the transmission of a spoken message in one language into a spoken message in another language using artificial intelligence. And the current solutions on the market can be divided into those for individuals that are like handheld devices you can use, or earbuds that you can use to discuss, to speak with someone in a different country. They're very popular on the Asian market. And solutions for businesses, the similar handheld devices exist, but increasingly they're being used on online conferencing platforms. And technology in this space has made a huge leap over the last few years, particularly due to the advances in machine-generated live subtitling. And this combination has meant that more and more companies are investing in speech-to-speech technology, and new solutions just keep popping up on the market. In the language industry, remote simultaneous interpreting providers are also coming into the space. So in January 2023, for example, Kudo became the first OSI platform to release its own machine interpreting feature, which was quickly followed by Interprify. And we just received news today, in fact, that Kudo has just managed to patent its machine interpreting technology at the US Patent Office. And Kai tools, maybe you've heard of them, but they're maybe less well known than machine interpreting tools. So this stands for computer assisted interpreting, just similar to CAT tools for translators. And there are a few solutions available: Smart Interpret Me, Interpret Bank, and SimoNote. And they're typically used by interpreters who are interpreting in a remote environment, but some can also be used for on-site. SimoNote can be used to actually help interpreters interpret consecutively. And they mix a variety of AI solutions like speech recognition, speech-to-text translation, and also manual input from the interpreters to prepare for an assignment, such as creating glossaries with specific terminology. But I must say that they still offer limited efficiency to interpreters because they're quite underdeveloped. They often have a price tag for the interpreters themselves, and yet the customization capabilities are still limited. They don't seem to offer effective automations for extracting terminology from relevant websites or documents. And it's often time consuming for interpreters to have to learn the ropes of this brand new, sometimes relatively complicated tool. And from the client side, we often hear about concerns about confidentiality and where will all this information end up, and who essentially owns the information that is kept on this Kai tool or the glossaries, for example. Interpreters also speak about the issues of owning the information that's there. If they've invested time and energy into a glossary, how can that glossary be then used for other interpreters and improve the Kai tool? But the benefits of Kai tools just couldn't be ignored. Look at what CAT tools have done for translators. A good Kai tool could mean less preparation time for interpreters and an improved or enhanced performance, which would essentially benefit the client as well. For remote simultaneous interpreting providers, as well as for LSPs, is that having a well-functioning Kai tool would mean that you can offer clients a wider pool of interpreters, because you could train new interpreters on these new adapted glossaries, and they could also be assisted by the Kai tool during the assignment. Moreover, Kai tools can often act as a client-interpreter exchange for documents, which might even remove the need for an intermediary from the provider side, which could save on costs and also introduce further time efficiencies. But we just simply don't know at this stage who is going to invest in Kai tools. An interpreter can use all these different tools that do different things, but for them all to be brought together into a streamlined, one-stop shop Kai tool, we just still haven't found that type of solution just yet, and we don't know who is going to invent it. And I haven't got the answer to that question. Maybe Renato, you do, but I certainly don't just yet.
Well, at the end of the day, I always comes back to that famous apocryphal story of that NASA spent millions of dollars to create a ball pen that could be used in space in zero gravity. And then they went and they asked the Russians how they had solved the problem, and they said that they used pencils, right? At the end of the day, I would tell our friends, interpreters, professional interpreters in the call, sharpen your skills. A good glossary, a good notebook, and a good sharpened pencil are going to save you and are more reliable than these technologies. They're amazing support for a good professional interpreter, but it doesn't ever replace the talent of an individual who can mediate conversations in a professional way, like you and the other colleagues that are in this call. It's a talent that I don't have, and I admire very much.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also it goes back to what I mentioned about clients offering a wider pool of interpreters. These still need to be professional interpreters, because you can't introduce someone overnight to a brand new topic and hope that it will all go smoothly just thanks to a Kai tool. Imagine if the tool crashed at that point, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's always you always need to be prepared, right? It's that when the microphone fails, when the headset doesn't work, you have to go back to your basic instincts and the ability to be there in the moment and save the day.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? Well, the interpreting industry has been through some ups and downs over the past few years, or I should probably say downs due to the pandemic and subsequent ups, but it has overall gone mainstream, receiving far more attention than ever before and occupying a more central role in the language services industry. And demand for interpreting services is simply booming. Although interpreting services providers struggled at the start of the pandemic, pretty much like everyone, they bounced back and are recording faster growth than in the past. Remember, 25 out of the 34 companies on our ranking recorded positive growth in 2021 and 2022. New players also came onto the scene, like RSI companies, which are now featuring on the ranking for the first time as well. And their tech services are now inextricably linked with the provision of interpreting services. So I can only leave you with a resoundingly positive message today that our industry is capable of adjusting to new times, overcoming economic uncertainty, and reinventing itself to come back stronger than before. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rosie. This is an amazing summary and detailed presentation of the findings of this year. But I would only add that interpreting is probably the segment of the language industry that is least likely to be immediately replaced by AI. The machine interpreting is something that is beginning. There are alternative solutions, but it's the one that requires the most talent from a professional to be delivered than all the other language services that we track. So I'm very happy that since the beginning of Nimdzi, we've been tracking this segment of the translation and localization space, because it's one that is very exciting, and I'm grateful for the amazing work that Sarah and you have done in putting together this report, and I hope that our attendees download and read the report on our site, because there's a lot more information in there than we presented here. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato. Thank you, Rosie. I'm going to jump back in here and take us out today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Whether you are joining us live or watching the recording afterwards, please also join me in sending your thanks, whether that's in the comments or otherwise, to our hosts, Renato and Rosie, today. Make sure to go follow them on LinkedIn to stay up to date with what they're doing and all of the cool research that they're putting out there. As we're finishing up, if you haven't already done so, make sure that you are following Nimdzi Insights here on your social media platform of choice. Make sure to go over to the LinkedIn page, Nimdzi's LinkedIn page, and check out the events tab to see what cool events are coming up. I know right after this we have a cool event coming up where we're talking about game culturalization with Kate Edwards, the famous Kate Edwards. So you don't want to miss that. We're going to have a double feature today. Also, make sure that you are going to Nimdzi Insights or nimdzi.com and checking out the Interpreting Index. As I mentioned earlier, we have a beautiful PDF version available for download, and if you are a multilingual magazine subscriber, you will be getting a copy in your mailbox soon. So keep an eye open for that. Once again, my name is Tucker Johnson. I've been joined by my colleagues, Rosemary Hynes and Renato Beninatto, and it has been our pleasure to host this today. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers.